The military funeral was a grand affair. Soldiers stood in formation, their uniforms crisp, their faces hardened. The war was still raging in Europe, but today they paused to honor one of their own. Colonel Elijah Gaines was dead. His body, burned beyond recognition, had been found after an ambush in enemy territory. The military declared him a war hero, a leader who gave his life for his country. At the front of the crowd, dressed in a long black veil, Vivian Gaines didn't shed a single tear. She didn't need to. She already had someone else to comfort her. A man standing just a few feet away. Sergeant Isaiah Holt, her husband's most trusted man, her secret lover, the man who should have been mourning beside her, but was instead standing just close enough to whisper promises into her ear. It started with a whisper, a rumor. Somebody saw something they weren't supposed to see. First, it was a bartender, then a soldier's wife, then a retired veteran who still had friends in high places. A man had been spotted, a man who was supposed to be dead. At first, people dismissed it as nonsense, ghost stories, war hysteria. But then, Colonel Elijah Gaines walked into town, alive, and he knew everything. Vivian thought she had buried her past. Isaiah thought he had gotten away with murder. But when the dead refuse to stay buried, the real nightmare begins. Stay with me, because this case, it only gets darker from here. The cold air clung to them like a second skin, sinking deep into their bones as they moved quietly through the dense French forest. The thick, towering pines swallowed what little moonlight broke through the rolling clouds above, leaving only the shifting shadows of armed men. It had been hours since they left base, and the silence had become deafening. No birds, no distant gunfire, just the rhythmic crunch of boots against frozen soil. Colonel Elijah Gaines adjusted the weight of his rifle, his senses sharp despite the exhaustion creeping in. A lifetime in war had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight, something wasn't right. The mission had been planned with precision. Intercept an enemy supply convoy, secure classified intelligence, and return. A high-risk operation, but nothing he hadn't done before. And yet, something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be a simple mission. He glanced back at his men, reading their faces in the dim glow of the frost-covered trees. They were alert, trained, disciplined. But tension was creeping in. Gaines could feel it. And he could feel something else, too. The weight of eyes watching them from somewhere unseen. Something was wrong. He didn't know what yet, but he could feel it crawling over his skin. His gaze flicked toward the man walking just behind him, Sergeant Isaiah Holt, his most trusted officer, his right-hand man. But lately, Gaines had noticed something different about him. A distance, a hesitation. Little things. Like how Holt avoided his gaze when they discussed the mission, or how he lingered too long near the maps in the strategy room, fingers tracing over coordinates like he was memorizing them. Twice, Gaines had noticed small discrepancies in their planned route. Nothing obvious, just slight shifts in the coordinates Holt had provided. He had dismissed them at first. Holt wasn't careless. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe Gaines was just overthinking. But now, walking through this dead forest with nothing but the sound of his own breath and the faint scent of gunpowder lingering in the cold, the doubt clawed at him. Then came the first sound, a distant click, subtle, almost imperceptible. A second later, the world erupted. The explosion threw Gaines backward before his brain even processed the noise. The air ignited with fire, screams, and the sharp crack of gunfire tearing through the night. The convoy was nowhere in sight. There were no German supply trucks. This was no interception. It was an ambush. Gunfire rained down from the trees, cutting men down before they could find cover. Gaines scrambled to his feet, shouting orders through the chaos, but the enemy was already in position. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a slaughter. His men were being wiped out before they even had a chance to fight back. His vision blurred from the smoke and blood splattering across his face, but through it, he saw something that made the breath in his lungs stall. Holt, not fighting, not scrambling for cover like the others, just standing, watching, and then turning away. Betrayal. Gaines had spent his entire career preparing for death. He had lost friends, seen men fall beside him, watched life drain from eyes that had been filled with fire only moments before. But this death was different. This was planned, orchestrated. Someone had set them up, and now he knew exactly who. Another explosion rocked the ground beneath him. Gaines turned, trying to find his bearings, but before he could move, a powerful force slammed into him from behind. His vision shattered into blackness. The last thing he heard before it swallowed him whole was the sound of his men dying. The official report came 2 days later. The mission had failed. The bodies had been recovered, the remains documented. Among them, they found what they believed to be Colonel Elijah Gaines. The corpse had been burned beyond recognition, but the uniform was still intact, charred and torn but unmistakable. The dog tags were recovered nearby, confirming the worst. The commanding officers back at headquarters didn't question it. Elijah Gaines was dead. A telegram was sent home. The news arrived on a gray morning in a quiet southern town. It had been 3 weeks since the ambush. Vivian Gaines answered the door, still wrapped in her silk nightgown, her dark curls pinned perfectly in place. The officer standing before her removed his hat, pressing his lips into a tight line before handing her the letter. The words were precise, written with military efficiency. They regretted to inform her that her husband had been killed in the line of duty. Vivian accepted the folded American flag with steady hands. She gave them the reaction they expected, the slow nod, the soft tremble in her lips, the quiet acceptance of grief. The neighbors watched from their porches, whispering about how strong she was, how gracefully she carried herself in mourning. She thanked the officers for their time, closed the door behind her, and stood in the silence of her home. The weight of the letter still lingered in her fingers, but she didn't cry. Instead, she exhaled. It was done. Her husband was gone, and Sergeant Isaiah Holt was waiting for her. For months, Vivian and Isaiah thought they were free. But what they didn't know was that Elijah Gaines was still alive, and what he knew would destroy them both. For 6 months after Colonel Elijah Gaines was declared dead, his widow, Vivian Gaines, lived the way society expected her to. She dressed in black, accepted condolences with a fragile grace, and sat at the front pew of the church every Sunday, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke softly as though grief had stolen her voice and kept her home in a state of quiet mourning. People admired her strength. The wives of other officers whispered about how tragic it was, how young she still was, how cruel fate could be to take a husband so soon. But their whispers weren't filled with pity alone. Beneath the surface, beneath the sympathetic smiles and shared Bible verses, there was curiosity and suspicion. Because grief looks different on every woman. And for someone who had just lost her husband, Vivian Gaines looked relieved. She played the part well, until she thought no one was watching. The first time she and Sergeant Isaiah Holt were seen together was only 2 months after Elijah's funeral. A Sunday afternoon. Church service had just ended, and the congregation was spilling onto the steps, dressed in their finest clothes. The sun was warm, a breeze rolling through the sleepy southern town, stirring the air with the scent of fresh earth and magnolia blossoms. It was the kind of day where nothing should have felt wrong. And yet, something did. Mrs. Dorothy Dot Carter had been the first to see them. She wasn't the type to gossip, but she was the kind of woman who noticed things. The way Vivian didn't flinch when Isaiah placed his hand on the small of her back. The way he leaned in a little too close when he spoke to her. The way she smiled, just a little too quickly at his jokes. It wasn't outright scandalous, not yet. But for a woman who was meant to be in mourning, Vivian Gaines looked just a little too comfortable beside another man. She kept her mouth shut that day, but the image lingered in her mind like a splinter beneath the skin. By the time the rumors truly started, it was already too late. Isaiah Holt was nothing like Colonel Gaines. He was younger, sharper, with a smile that could convince a man to walk straight into hell if he asked nicely. He had charm, and he knew how to use it. While Elijah had been a man of rules and discipline, Isaiah had always been about bending them. He and Vivian had always known each other, but in the months after Elijah's death, their relationship changed. What had once been an unspoken tension, a glance too long, a touch that lingered, became something else entirely. At first it had been careful, secret. Isaiah never spent the night. He left through the back door. Vivian never let him touch her in public. But desire is a reckless thing. By the time winter came, people had started talking. Sergeant Holt was seen at the house more often, always with an excuse, bringing firewood, checking in on the widow of a fallen officer, making sure she was safe. And then, of course, there was the music. Dot Carter lived 3 houses down. She wasn't the prying type, but she had ears. And at night, when the town was still and the windows were cracked open just slightly to let in the cool air, she heard the music drifting from Vivian's house. Vivian's late husband had never played records, but Isaiah Holt did. And late into the night, the smooth, slow melodies of jazz filled the walls of the home that once belonged to Colonel Elijah Gaines. By the time spring came, they weren't hiding anymore. Vivian no longer dressed in black. She started wearing color again, her lips painted a shade of red too bold for a grieving widow. She laughed more. Her voice had returned, and with it, the sharp wit that had been dulled by years of marriage to a man as serious as Elijah. She started looking happy. And maybe, if things had gone the way they planned, she would have been. But the dead don't stay buried forever. It started with a rumor, a name spoken in hushed voices. It had come from a soldier, one who had just returned from overseas, still wearing his uniform, the dust of war still clinging to his boots. He had been at a bar, drinking away the ghosts that followed men home from battle, when he heard it. A man matching Colonel Gaines's description had been seen. At first, people dismissed it. Men see all kinds of things after war. Their minds play tricks on them, pulling ghosts out of shadows, weaving stories from nothing. But then another soldier claimed the same thing, and then another. And then one night, Dot Carter found herself standing outside Vivian's house, staring at the front door, debating whether or not she should knock. Because she had just heard something she couldn't ignore. She had been in town that afternoon when she overheard 2 men talking in low voices outside the bar. "I swear it," one of them had said, his voice shaking. "I saw him. I know I did." The words sent an icy chill down Dot's spine. That night, as she stood outside Vivian's house, the music playing softly from inside, she had a sudden, terrible feeling that things were about to change. And she was right. Because the very next day, Colonel Elijah Gaines walked into town. For months, Vivian and Isaiah had convinced themselves they were safe, that the past was buried, that no one would ever know the truth. But when the man you've killed walks back into town, breathing, watching, knowing, the game changes. And this time, Elijah Gaines wasn't coming home as a husband. He was coming back for revenge. The arrival of Colonel Elijah Gaines should have been impossible. Dead men do not walk into town. They do not arrive on a train platform in a crisp uniform, carrying the weight of war in their eyes, nor do they march through familiar streets as if they had never left. But on an otherwise unremarkable morning, with the town just beginning to stir, Elijah Gaines did exactly that. The few who saw him first did not react immediately. The mind is slow to accept the impossible, preferring instead to search for rationality. Perhaps it was a mistake, a man who simply bore a resemblance to the late colonel. Perhaps it was a trick of the light. But the moment his gaze locked onto familiar faces, former soldiers, townspeople who had stood at his funeral, doubt gave way to disbelief, and disbelief quickly unraveled into terror. The news spread like wildfire, passing from house to house, shop to shop, whispered on street corners and behind closed doors. No one understood how it was possible, only that it was. The man they had mourned, the man whose widow had been comforted and whose flag had been folded with reverence, was alive. And worse, he had come home. Vivian Gaines had always imagined what it would feel like to see her husband's ghost. It had been a fleeting thought in the beginning, nothing more than a dark curiosity lurking in the back of her mind. But time had reassured her. The past remained buried where it belonged, and no amount of regret or suspicion could change that. Until now. The moment the name reached her ears, the room around her seemed to shift. Her pulse slowed, the air grew thin, and the world became eerily quiet. She did not react as others might have expected. There was no cry of relief, no frantic sprint to confirm the truth. Instead, she sat still, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her dress, the color draining from her face. She did not need to ask if it was true. She already knew. Isaiah Holt was less composed. If Vivian felt the world slipping beneath her feet, Isaiah had already lost his footing completely. He had always been a man in control, confident in his choices, able to talk his way out of any situation. But this was not a matter of words or persuasion. There was no argument to be made, no explanation to give. They had ensured Elijah Gaines was dead, and yet, somehow he was walking, breathing, and worst of all, he was here. The walls of safety they had built for themselves over the past year came crashing down in an instant. The unspoken arrangement they had enjoyed, the comfort they had settled into, now felt like a noose tightening around their throats. The confrontation did not happen immediately. Elijah did not knock on the door, did not demand answers or accusations. He did something far worse. He waited. His presence alone was enough to dismantle everything they had built. He did not seek them out, but he did not hide either. He moved through the town deliberately, making no attempt to explain himself, no effort to comfort those who had mourned him. He did not acknowledge the whispers or the fearful glances. He did not answer questions. He simply existed. The waiting was its own form of cruelty. Vivian could not step outside without feeling his gaze somewhere in the distance, lingering just long enough for her to notice before he turned away. Isaiah found himself watching his back at all times, expecting something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Not yet. The silence stretched for days, suffocating in its intensity. Elijah had always been a calculating man, precise in his movements and measured in his actions. Whatever game he was playing, he had set the board long before they even realized they were pieces in it. The whispers in town grew louder. No one knew where Elijah had been or how he had survived. The military had no record of his return, no official statement to explain the error. His arrival was a mystery, and that mystery only deepened with each passing day. There were those who tried to approach him, soldiers who had once fought under his command, but he offered them nothing. He spoke little, giving no details of his supposed death, no answers to the questions that burned in their minds. Instead, he asked his own. Not about the war, not about his disappearance, but about his wife. And Sergeant Isaiah Holt. He was patient. He had time. They did not. The weight of the truth was unbearable. They had planned so carefully, removed every loose end. But if Elijah was alive, it meant there had been a mistake, one they could not afford. And the worst part, Elijah knew. There was no rage in his expression when their paths finally crossed. No accusations, no confrontations. Just an unshakable certainty in his gaze, a quiet knowledge that stripped them bare. He had not come home to reclaim his life. He had come home to destroy theirs. The moment Isaiah Holt stepped outside that night and saw Elijah Gaines standing across the street, he knew something was coming. The waiting had stretched long enough. The silence had served its purpose, driving the wedge of fear deep into their bones. Elijah had let them crumble under the weight of their own guilt, had forced them into paranoia, into restless nights and uneasy days. But now, the time for patience had passed. The game was beginning. Isaiah could feel it in his gut. Vivian had not been able to leave the house that day. She had woken up looking pale, her usual confidence rattled beyond recognition. The strain of seeing Elijah around every corner had hollowed her out, left her brittle. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something worse. Something neither of them had dared say aloud. Doubt. Because no matter how many times they told themselves it was impossible, a question had rooted itself in their minds, festering beneath the surface. If Elijah had been alive all along, if he had somehow escaped, then who had they buried? And what if Elijah knew? The thought was unbearable. Isaiah had left the house in a desperate attempt to clear his mind, to escape the suffocating presence of a woman who was breaking apart in front of him. He needed space, air, a moment to collect himself. But stepping outside had only made it worse, because Elijah was waiting. No words were spoken, there was no need. The air was thick with meaning, the kind of understanding that did not require conversation. Elijah turned and walked away, and Isaiah followed. His steps were heavy, his pulse hammering in his ears as he trailed Elijah through the dimly lit streets. He knew it was a mistake. Every rational part of him screamed to stop, to turn back, to pretend he had never seen him. But there was something in the way Elijah moved, steady, certain, that made it clear there was no turning back. The walk stretched longer than Isaiah expected, leading them away from the town square, past the quiet homes with their darkened windows, past the buildings that stood like silent witnesses to something about to unfold. By the time they reached the old boarding house where Elijah had been staying, the streets had emptied completely. Elijah did not look back. He did not wait for an invitation to be acknowledged. He stepped inside, and Isaiah followed. The room was sparse, just as Isaiah had expected. A single bed, a desk, a wooden chair. It was barely lived in, as though Elijah had not planned on staying long. But that was not what caught Isaiah's attention. His eyes fell on the desk, on the collection of documents neatly spread across it. Military records. Isaiah's breath hitched. He recognized the reports immediately. Intelligence logs, classified files, an entire investigation. Elijah had not just returned. He had come back with proof. The pieces slid into place before Isaiah could stop them. Elijah had been in the process of exposing something before his supposed death. That was why he had been ambushed. He had uncovered something, had known something dangerous. Isaiah's pulse pounded in his throat. The attack had not been an accident. Elijah had been targeted. And the worst part? Elijah knew who had betrayed him. The realization settled into Isaiah's bones with a sickening weight, but Elijah's next move made it clear he was not in control of the situation. Because Elijah reached into the desk and pulled out a single letter. A letter with Vivian's name on it, and then he spoke for the first time since returning home. Give this to her. Isaiah did not remember leaving the room. He did not remember walking back through the empty streets, his hands clenched so tightly around the letter that his knuckles burned. But by the time he reached the house, Vivian was waiting. The sight of her sent a fresh wave of anger through him, anger at her for dragging him into this, anger at Elijah for being alive, anger at himself for being too much of a coward to see any of it coming. He thrust the letter toward her without a word. Vivian took it with trembling fingers. Isaiah watched as her expression changed, watched as the blood drained from her face. The letter fell from her grasp. And when Isaiah picked it up, his heart stopped. Because it was not just a letter. It was a signed witness statement, a confession, signed by the only other man who knew the truth about what happened on that battlefield. And that man had been dead for a year. Elijah had returned with more than just survival. He had returned with evidence. But the dead do not confess. And now, Isaiah and Vivian had only one question left to answer. Who had signed that letter? The letter sat between them, the ink standing bold against the crisp white paper, the signature at the bottom an undeniable weight pressing against their chests. The name scrawled at the end was not Elijah's. It was not Vivian's. It was not Isaiah's. It belonged to Sergeant Floyd Redding, and Sergeant Floyd Redding was dead. Vivian's fingers twitched as she stared down at the paper, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of what lay before her. Isaiah had not moved since picking it up, his breathing shallow, his body rigid. Floyd Redding had been one of their own, a man who had served under Elijah, a soldier who had been with them on that final mission. He had not made it out alive. Isaiah had seen his body himself, had left it behind in the chaos of gunfire and smoke. There had been no mistake. Floyd Redding had died that night, along with Elijah, or so they had thought. But now his signature was here, on a document detailing what had really happened on that battlefield. And the details were devastating. Floyd Redding had written about a betrayal from within. He had written about coordinates being changed, about an ambush that had not been the result of bad intelligence, but of deliberate sabotage. He had written about a fellow soldier who had ensured the enemy knew exactly where they would be. And he had written the name of that soldier. Isaiah Holt. Isaiah felt the world tilt under him. His lungs burned, his pulse pounded in his ears, but his eyes refused to move from the accusation on the page. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. Floyd had never written this. He had never known what Isaiah had done. He had died before he could know. And yet, his name was here. The blood drained from Isaiah's face as realization settled in. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about destruction. Elijah had come back not only to haunt them, not only to unravel their lives piece by piece, but to leave no way out. Because this statement was proof. This wasn't a ghost story whispered in dark corners. This wasn't paranoia and speculation. This was military documentation. This was evidence. Vivian's breath hitched as she grabbed the paper from Isaiah's hands, her eyes scanning the words with wild urgency. She shook her head, whispering to herself, denial taking hold. This was a forgery. It had to be. But Isaiah knew better. Forging a military document this precise, this airtight, was no easy feat. This had come from somewhere real, and if the military got their hands on it, he was as good as dead. Isaiah turned, pushing past Vivian, his mind racing. He needed to find Elijah. He needed to end this, to get ahead of it before it was too late. But the moment he reached for the door, a slow realization dawned over him. Elijah had given him this letter. Elijah had wanted him to see it, which meant it was already too late. His chest tightened as he stepped back, hands running through his hair in frantic thought. If Elijah had gone to this extent, if he had spent all these months setting this trap, then he had already set the next move in motion. Somewhere, right now, this document was already being seen by someone who mattered, someone with authority, and when they came knocking, there would be no escape. Vivian stumbled back against the chair, her hands covering her mouth, her face ashen. She saw it too now, the inevitability of it all. Elijah had been patient, had planned every step. He had given them just enough time to self-destruct on their own, to crumble under their own fear. And now, when they were at their weakest, he was closing the door behind them. The evidence was real. The trap had been set. And now there was only one question left to answer. Would they run? Or would they fight a battle they had already lost? The knock they had been expecting never came. Instead, the sound that shattered the silence was a low, deliberate tapping. Not at the front door, at the window. Vivian's body seized with cold terror as her eyes snapped toward the sound. The curtain was drawn, shielding them from whoever was outside, but she didn't need to see. She already knew. Elijah. Isaiah's hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching. He had carried his pistol on him ever since Elijah returned, had slept with it under his pillow, had considered more than once just ending this nightmare with a bullet. But the fear outweighed the rage. They didn't move. For a moment the tapping stopped. The silence stretched. Then came another sound, the slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. Isaiah snapped into motion, lunging for the door and locking it before it could be pushed open. His breath was ragged, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He could feel Vivian behind him, frozen in place, the air between them thick with unspoken terror. Then finally Elijah spoke. His voice was calm, steady, almost conversational. There was no anger, no urgency, just quiet amusement, laced with something else, something darker. They did not answer. Elijah didn't try again. The knob remained still, and then, just like that, he was gone. But he had left something behind. A second letter slipped under the door. Isaiah hesitated before picking it up, as if whatever was inside might explode in his hands. He unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the words. It was short, a date, a time, and a location. It was not a request, it was a summons. Elijah wanted to meet, and he had made it clear. This was their only chance to face him before the military did. Isaiah swallowed, his throat dry. There was no choice. Either they went to Elijah or they waited for the law to come to them. Vivian exhaled shakily. Her eyes met Isaiah's, and for the first time, there was no calculation, no manipulation, no carefully constructed illusion. Just raw, naked fear. Because no matter which door they chose, one truth was painfully clear. There was no way out. Elijah had given them an opportunity, one final moment to face him before their entire world collapsed. But why? What did he want? And what would happen when they finally met the dead man they had buried? The moment they stepped into the abandoned storage building, they knew this was it. The game had gone on long enough. There would be no more waiting, no more mind games. Elijah was sitting at the wooden table, his posture relaxed, as if he had been expecting them. The flickering light above him cast deep shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. He didn't react when Isaiah closed the door behind them. Vivian remained a step behind Isaiah, her breathing slow and measured. She had not spoken since they left the house. There was nothing left to say. They both knew why they were here. Elijah did too. He slid a piece of paper across the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the worn surface. Isaiah didn't move to pick it up. He already knew what it was. Another document, another revelation, another step toward the noose Elijah had been tightening around their necks. But this time there would be no countermove. Elijah lifted his gaze, finally meeting Isaiah's eyes. There was no fear in them, no urgency. Just quiet certainty, the look of a man who had already decided how this night would end. Isaiah pulled the gun. The silence in the room stretched thin, so fragile it felt like it might snap at any moment. For the first time since his return, Elijah smiled. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't mockery. It was something else entirely. Understanding. Isaiah's hands did not shake. He had killed before. He had pulled the trigger on men in war, had watched them fall with the same detachment he felt now. But this was different. This was personal. Vivian stood beside him, her pulse steady, her eyes locked onto Elijah with quiet determination. She did not flinch. She had always known it would come to this. Isaiah fired the first shot. The impact sent Elijah backward, his body hitting the chair hard, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the empty room. Blood bloomed across his chest, dark and spreading fast, but he did not fall completely. He was still breathing. Vivian stepped forward. The knife had been hidden beneath her coat, the weight of it pressing against her skin since the moment they left the house. She had been waiting, knowing that a gunshot was too quick, too merciful. Elijah's breath came shallow as he stared up at her, his body weakened, his strength fading. He did not try to move, did not try to stop what was coming. Vivian did not hesitate. The blade sank in deep, cutting through flesh with terrifying ease. Elijah exhaled sharply, a sound almost too quiet to be heard. His body sagged, the last of his strength slipping away. The game was over, and they had won, or so they thought. Vivian stepped back, her hands coated in red, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Isaiah watched as Elijah's body went still, the weight of what they had done settling over them. For months, they had been prisoners of his presence, trapped in his silence, waiting for his inevitable revenge. But now he was gone, truly gone. And yet, as they stood there, staring down at the lifeless body of the man who had tormented them, neither of them felt the relief they had expected. Something was wrong. The room felt too quiet. The weight of something unseen pressed against them, thick and suffocating. Then, Vivian's breath hitched. Isaiah turned toward her, but her gaze was locked onto something behind him. The door. The knob was turning. Before they could move, before they could react, the door burst open. The military police had arrived, and they had just walked in on a murder. Elijah had haunted them for months, unraveling them piece by piece. But even in death, he had the final move, because now there was no way to escape what was coming. The sound of boots striking the floor was deafening. The heavy door swung open with force, slamming against the wall as the room was flooded with men in military uniforms. The moment should have felt like an ambush, but the truth was worse. This had never been an ambush at all. This had been planned. Elijah had set them up even in death. Vivian was the first to react, her breath catching in her throat as her body stiffened. Isaiah barely had time to register the weight of what was happening before the voice cut through the thick, blood-heavy air. Hands up. It wasn't a request. There was no use resisting. They both knew that. The moment the military police stormed in, the outcome was already decided. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence, and Elijah's body lying between them like a verdict that had already been passed. Isaiah's grip on the knife loosened, his fingers numb, his pulse roaring in his ears. He barely felt the hands grabbing at him, barely registered the sharp pressure of a rifle butt pressing against his back, forcing him to his knees. Vivian had dropped before they even touched her. It wasn't out of surrender. It was out of sheer shock. She was staring at Elijah's body, her lips parted as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Even as they were forced to the ground, even as they were handcuffed and pulled roughly to their feet, her gaze never left him. Isaiah had been ready for violence. He had been prepared for gunfire, for a fight, for the desperate adrenaline-fueled struggle that came with a man refusing to be caged. But this was something else. They weren't being treated as prisoners of war. They were being treated as murderers. The soldiers moved with cold efficiency, speaking only when necessary. The officer in charge barely acknowledged Isaiah as he was pulled upright, his arms wrenched behind him, the steel cuffs biting into his wrists. He did not look at Isaiah. He was looking at Elijah. And that was when Isaiah realized this wasn't about justice. This was about something much bigger. The courtroom was cold, a hollow space filled with silent judgment. The walls, lined with military insignias, bore witness to a trial that had been set in motion long before Vivian and Isaiah were dragged into this room. Their fate had already been sealed the moment Elijah fell. There had been no drawn-out investigations, no second chances. The moment the military police found them standing over Elijah's body, their hands coated in his blood, The trial was inevitable. But the real punishment hadn't begun with their arrest. It had begun the moment the charges were read. Murder was expected. Treason was not. Vivian sat still, her back straight, her expression carefully blank. She had been silent since the day of their arrest, speaking only when necessary, answering questions with carefully measured words. But inside, something had shifted. Isaiah knew that look. It was the same one she had worn the night they buried Elijah the first time, the look of a woman who had realized too late that she had been playing the wrong game. The prosecution wasted no time. The case was built like a noose, each detail tightening around them, suffocating them. Elijah had left behind more than just whispers of betrayal. He had left behind proof. The folder, the one Isaiah had never opened before he pulled the trigger, was filled with classified intelligence, documents that Elijah had been collecting before his staged death. Reports of war crimes, of soldiers who had turned on their own, of a conspiracy buried within the ranks. And now Isaiah and Vivian were at the center of it. The evidence was damning. A written statement, signed by a dead man, Sergeant Floyd Redding, detailing the sabotage that led to Elijah's ambush. Military files showing coordinates being altered before the failed mission. Handwritten notes Elijah had compiled, pointing toward a betrayal within his own unit. The timeline was airtight. The betrayal had been planned before Elijah's so-called death. The ambush had been orchestrated from within. And the final, irrefutable proof? Elijah had made sure the world knew who had given up those coordinates. Isaiah Holt. The weight of the accusation settled in the room like a physical force. Isaiah didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had always known that Elijah wasn't just looking for revenge. He had been looking for justice. What he hadn't expected was what happened next. Vivian. She hadn't spoken in days, hadn't given a single sign of weakness. But as the charges were laid out, as the witnesses took the stand, her hands began to tremble. It started small, a barely noticeable quiver. Then her breathing shifted, uneven and sharp. Isaiah turned toward her, his mind racing. He knew Vivian better than anyone. She never broke. Not when they buried Elijah the first time. Not when they spent months waiting for him to return. Not even when they killed him for real. But now, as the walls closed in, as the full weight of what they had done crashed over them, she was unraveling. The prosecution continued, hammering down every last piece of evidence, but Isaiah wasn't listening anymore. He was watching Vivian. She was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Her breath came faster, shallow, desperate. And then, just as the silence in the courtroom stretched too far, she spoke. The words were soft at first, barely a whisper. Then, louder. And then, before Isaiah could stop her, she confessed. Vivian Gaines, the woman who had walked through fire, who had built an entire life on deception, who had spent a year pretending her husband was dead, admitted to everything. Murder, conspiracy, and worse. She turned on Isaiah. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge banged the gavel, demanding silence, but the damage had already been done. Vivian had cut a deal, and Isaiah had never seen it coming. She told them everything. How Isaiah had planned the attack on Elijah's unit. How she had only gone along with it out of fear. How she had no choice but to help cover it up once she realized what he had done. She painted herself as a victim. A grieving widow manipulated by a man who had already betrayed his commanding officer, his fellow soldiers, his country. And she was good at it. She had always been good at it. Isaiah barely heard the words. He was still staring at her, trying to find something in her face that wasn't there. Remorse, regret, anything. But Vivian wasn't sorry. She had never planned to go down with him. This had always been about self-preservation. The prosecution wasted no time in shifting its focus. The trial had been moving toward sentencing, both of them facing certain execution. But now, with Vivian's sudden cooperation, everything was different. They turned on Isaiah like a pack of wolves. The evidence had always pointed to him. The altered coordinates, his doing, the ambush, a direct result of his actions, the final murder of Elijah Gaines. His hands were still stained with the blood. Vivian had crafted the perfect escape for herself, shifting the full weight of the crime onto Isaiah. And the worst part? The jury believed her. The deliberation didn't take long. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Vivian sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale but composed. Isaiah wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her. The words that sealed his fate were spoken with the cold finality of a man who had made this decision long before today. Guilty of treason. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift. Death by hanging. A gasp rippled through the room, but Vivian didn't react. Isaiah didn't move. His fate had been sealed the moment Elijah walked back into town. He had just been too blind to see it. But what happened next? That was unexpected, because while Isaiah's fate had been decided, Vivian's was not. The prosecution stood again, pressing forward with one final argument. Vivian Gaines had been complicit. She had lied. She had helped cover up a murder. She had played a role in the deception. Yes, she had turned on Isaiah. Yes, she had confessed. But was it enough? The courtroom was no longer on her side. The prosecution argued that a woman who could lie so well, so effortlessly, could not be trusted. That she was just as guilty as the man she had betrayed. The judge did not deliberate long. When the final sentence was read, Vivian's face finally cracked. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of obstruction of justice. The sentence? Life in prison. Isaiah saw it before she did. The way her fingers trembled, the way her breath caught just slightly in her throat, the way her face paled as she realized she had miscalculated. She had not won. She had not walked free. Vivian Gaines had saved herself from death, but she had sentenced herself to a fate she would never escape. Isaiah was going to die. Vivian was going to rot. And Elijah Gaines? Even in death, he had taken everything from them. The legacy of Colonel Elijah Gaines did not die with him. His body was buried with full military honors, his casket draped in the American flag. The funeral was attended by dozens of officers, government officials, and soldiers who had once served under him. But there were no speeches about revenge, only justice. The military made sure the truth was known. The full story of what had happened in that ambush, the betrayal that led to the deaths of men who should have made it home, the murder that followed. The crimes of Isaiah Holt and Vivian Gaines were immortalized in history. There was no sympathy for them. There were no protests, no appeals for leniency. They had buried a man once and believed that was the end of it. But Elijah had not stayed buried. He had pulled himself back from the dead, not to live, but to make sure those who betrayed him never truly lived again. Isaiah Holt's name was erased from all military records. No honors, no recognition, no grave marked in his memory. He ceased to exist the moment the noose tightened around his throat. Vivian Gaines fared no better. Her case was one of scandal, a cautionary tale of greed and deception. Her face, once admired, was now a reminder of how quickly the mighty could fall. She had sacrificed everything to save herself, only to learn that survival meant nothing if there was nothing left to live for. She died behind those prison walls decades later, long forgotten. Her name mentioned only in whispers of disgrace.